at the University of Edinburgh. As part of his current post, he coordinates the MScs in Education, Comparative Education, and International Development pathway. Formerly, Mr. Williams worked as a senior policy analyst at UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report and a Thomas J. Alexander Fellow with the OECD. His recent research explores issues around quality and inclusion in global learning metrics and SDG 4. This includes chapters in the Garden Goal 4, edited by Wolf 2020, Testing and Inclusive Schooling, edited by Widenson, Morin, and Henry 2018. And in the second edition of Education and International Development, edited by Mark Gowan and Yuna Alta, forthcoming. Oh my, oh my, oh my. I'm so much in love with what I just read. So much, and I cannot wait to listen, watch, and hear what Mr. Wills have to give us today. And I hope we are all ready to listen to him and enjoy the presentation. Please, we are encouraged to keep our questions and comments coming in at the chat session. Do not hesitate, and it will be tackled for you. Mr. Will Smith, you have an hour for your presentation and 50 minutes for questions and answers. Please take over and enjoy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Christabel, for the warm introduction. I also want to thank the WO Early Childhood Institute for inviting me, especially Lily for reaching out to me on this. So I'm going to try to share my screen now. See if we're successful. All right, Christabel, can we see it?
Please.
Excellent.
Jesus.
Okay, well, I think this is going to be a little different than your first 2 days. As Christabel mentioned, before I was at the University of Edinburgh, I was at UNESCO working on the Global Education Monitoring Report. And I was at UNESCO just after the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I started there in 2016 and worked from 2016 to 2019 at UNESCO. So this research and look at SDG 4 and how it captures quality and inclusion is based in part on my own work and based part of my experience at UNESCO. So as you're probably aware, the Sustainable Development Goal 4 has one big overarching goal. That's to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And I'm interested in whether or not we're talking about inclusion as quality, where inclusion is inseparable from quality. Inclusion is required for quality. You can't claim you have quality education without having inclusion. Or whether this is really seen as two separate components in education. Whether we have inclusion or we can have quality, but we don't necessarily need them both. My argument, I'm going to start with this and then say how we got there, is that the Sustainable Development Goal process started very ambitious with large aspirations and really saw inclusion as key. And so it starts with an understanding that inclusion is necessary for quality. But increasingly, as the Sustainable Development Goal for education is developed, we see these two concepts separated. And that has real implications for what we see in education and what we need to do in the fight going forward. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and broadening of inclusive education. I'll spend most of my time talking about the creation of SDG 4. How did we get from this aspirational view of inclusion as required for quality to inclusion as potentially separate from equality. This will talk about some of the rival visions and the creation and operationalization of SDG 4, how we look at differences at the principal level. So I've spent a lot of my time looking at global level education, which I'm sure is very different than some of the local, community, national level good talks we've had in the last 2 days. So I'll talk about the differences between the global principles and what that looks like in practice, and then end with a renewed call for action. So to get started, because I know that I have probably many more inclusive education experts in the room than me. I consider myself a global education expert, not necessarily focused entirely on inclusive ed though. So if we look at a brief history of inclusive education, we can see that prior to the 1970s, in large part, there's a sense that students with special needs are excluded from education, that they weren't able to be educated in some countries, that it wasn't appropriate to educate them in others. And we saw some early movement towards an integration model in some countries, specifically the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1975, the United States passes the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which in 1990 is rebranded as the Individuals with Disabilities Act. In the United States, we see the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. In 1995, the United Kingdom passes the Disability Discrimination Act. And in the early 90s, we start to see this picking up steam at the global level. So 1994, we have the Salamanca Statement and related framework for action on action for special needs education. This is one of the key global moments. We have the Salamanca Statement signed by 92 countries in 1994. And at this point, we are still seeing inclusive education as very much we need to take students with special needs or children with special needs and educate them, either in separate schools or in mainstream schools. Over the past 30 years, however, there's been a transformation in how we understand inclusive education. It's gone from a narrow definition in the 90s and 80s that focused on students with special needs, and we need to get students with special needs into regular schools. There is a sense that in order to be successful, inclusive education needed expert knowledge and specialist teachers. So you have special education teachers, which are then teaching special needs students in special education classrooms. And more recently, we've seen the narrow definition change to a broader definition. So individuals like Slee and Allen talk about this as a social movement against educational exclusion. There's a focus here on barriers to education for all students. So this goes beyond integration, where we just need students accessing mainstream schools and classrooms, to adapting schools to fit the needs of all learners. And this is reflected nicely in General Comment 4 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where initially when that convention came out, it was focused much more on children and people with special needs. And this general comment then expands the definition of inclusion, talks about core features of inclusion, including a whole systems approach, a whole environmental education approach, where we're really focusing on all learners and how inclusive education for all learners benefits students, whether or not they have special needs. So we've got a transformation going on from a narrow definition to a broad definition. The broad definition partially laid out in that general comment, has some basic principles to it. So all children have the right to a good quality education. Education needs to be flexibly shaped to meet the needs of all learners. And they should meet the needs of learners where they're currently at, and then move them forward. That these practices and pedagogies common and inclusive education are a central part of quality education. You cannot separate inclusive pedagogy from quality education. You cannot have quality education without inclusion. And because inclusion is part of a whole school approach, it's not specialist teachers anymore. All teachers need to be trained in inclusive pedagogy. We've got a broad view of inclusive education, and really that's part of what we're capturing as we move into SDG 4. A broad view, an aspirational view, where we're going to be able to provide quality education for all learners. And that quality is going to be shaped in part by some of the principles of inclusive education. So we get to SDG 4, sorry, we see it was quite a collaborative process. It brought together efforts of the Millennium Development Goals Summit. Remember, the Millennium Development Goals ran from 2000 to 2015. And the Rio Plus 20 conference, which happened in 2012. Rio was focused on environmental sustainability. So it brought together the whole development world and under a single umbrella. In the 4 years leading up to Sustainable Development Goal, there were intense conversations with civil society and governments, had consultations in over 60 countries, and it led Jordan Nadeau, who was one of the key people at UNESCO around the Sustainable Development Goals, to state that arguably it was the most inclusive process of consultation in the history of the United Nations. So we have a very inclusive process at the end of this, shaping inclusive education to a broad form, which means really we can see the creation of Sustainable Development Goal 4 as the culmination of the movement towards this broad definition of inclusive education. And that's really clear in the overarching goal that I've stated before, but again, is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So this captures the broad definition. Sustainable Development 4, or Sustainable Development Goal 4, really is the endpoint for pushing towards a broad definition. But a broad definition, those that believe in a humanistic or human rights approach to education weren't the only ones being consulted on the way to the Sustainable Development Goals. There were rival visions in the creation of SDG 4. And when we think about inclusion as quality, it's important for us to think about, well, what is quality? Whose definition of quality are we talking about? This is quality for whom? When we think about what is quality, we need to understand that their discussions and definitions of quality are political and embedded in different ideological perspectives. When we are considering quality and whose quality it is, we need to ask ourselves at least 3 questions. So first, does the definition of quality recognize a single universal understanding of quality education? Or is quality based on some local context that's been recognized? Second, does the definition capture this broad holistic view of education? which is often what we think about when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals? Or is quality narrowed down to something specific within the education system? And finally, does the definition of quality limit quality education to formal schooling, or does it recognize that individuals learn in non-formal and informal settings as well? So in this build-up to SDG 4, we had multiple groups putting forth their version of quality education, hoping that it would be included in the Sustainable Development Goals. The two most well-known perspectives leading up to the Sustainable Development Goals was what is often captured in academic literature, at least, as a utilitarian perspective. You could think about this as a more economic perspective, maybe even a neoliberal perspective. And in this, the aim of education is to prepare children to work within an established social economic order with the ultimate goal of achieving economic growth. So there's a certain utility or end goal in education that we want to see positive economic outputs. And what this does is it emphasizes a narrow school-based learning outcomes. These are typically linked to foundational skills, which then serve as the basis for other educational outcomes. In comparison, the other rival position is often talked about as a humanistic or rights-based approach or perspective. The aim here is to address the inequalities and injustices that are embedding in the larger society. This is a transformational view of education, where education is not just shaping society, but it's shaped to society. Here, humanistic perspectives emphasize equity and rights-based approaches and have a broad understanding of quality that's not been narrowed down to learning outcomes or foundational skills. These conceptions of quality recognize the importance of inputs, processes, and outcomes. So in the build-up to SDG 4, these rival perspectives were engaged with through a series of really important meetings. So once again, this starts kind of after the 2012 meeting in Rio and runs to the creation of the SDGs in 2015. And we look at these, different stakeholders coming with different ideological perspectives are included in these different meetings. Now, in the first one, the high-level panel, this is a high-level panel that was appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Leading that panel were leaders from Indonesia, Liberia, and the United Kingdom, but directing the emphasis of that panel tended to be the United Kingdom, which meant that that panel tended to focus more on the aims of the United Kingdom's development agency, DFID. In 2014, we see the creation of lots of different important meetings. And one key group, which is the OWG, or the Open Working Group. And so they're created, and within the Open Working Group, there are 30 seats. Each seat is representing 3 countries. And then these 30 seats within the Open Working Group are getting inputs in from other places. So including from trade unions, from NGOs, from indigenous peoples, and so. So at the beginning of 2014 is the Open Working Group. We can see April 2014, we have the EFA Steering Committee. So this is the Education for All Steering Committee. It is based at UNESCO. And what this document does is basically endorse, to some extent, the views of the Open Working Group, which I'll get to in a second. So this is a position paper really coming from UNESCO and what they believe Sustainable Development Goals should be. This is different than the SDSN report, which is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This SDSN is led by Jeffrey Sachs, who's at Columbia University, and brings together professors, other high-level political figures, businesses, but nobody from the Education for All movement. We have two very different groups trying to input into the Sustainable Development Goals here. In 2014, the Muscat Agreement is another Education for All piece, where we are bringing together civil society, country delegations, private sector, multilateral and bilateral organizations at the 2014 Education for All meeting. So the OWG progress report then feeds in and basically follows the Education for All perspective on a rights-based approach to education. The United Nations SG synthesis report, so steering group synthesis report, then takes everything we've seen from 2014 and tries to make sense of it. This is followed in 2015 by the Incheon Declaration in Incheon, South Korea, which is the World Education Forum. This brings together all the Education for All actors, civil society, ministries, and 7 UN organizations, and really creates the foundation of what we understand as the Sustainable Development Goals, as we currently see them. And in November 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals are finalized, and the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which is signed off by 184 countries at UNESCO's headquarters. So this is some of the consultation process leading up to the Sustainable Development Goal 4. And it's important to understand the debates and the different perspectives that were part of this process when we were trying to understand, is inclusion part of quality, or is inclusion separate from quality? So Elaine Underhalter went through these 8 documents and tried to understand, what does quality look like at the end of each of these meetings? So she recognizes that there are 2 main groups coming out of this. The ones in dark gray, the high-level panel and the SDSN network, are expert-led groups, meaning they're typically led by academics, sometimes by politicians, but there's not really any input from civil society in this, and there's no input or participation from what is the Education for All community. Not surprisingly, she recognizes that in these 2 meetings, with these 2 reports, quality is really narrowly constructed. Quality is basically learning outcomes, and these 2 meetings are taking a very utilitarian approach to education, where the goal is not education in itself, it is education for economic gains. That's different than everything in orange, where increasingly, as we move closer to 2015, we see a rights-based approach dominate. The humanistic perspective starts to really come out. This is somewhat weakly identified in the Education for All Steering Committee in April 2015, But in the Muscat Agreement, and especially in the Incheon Declaration and the Framework for Action, we see a broad view of quality, and inclusion is now more or less considered part of that view. So part of what I'm doing for the chapter based on this presentation, or associated with it, is I'm going through and saying, okay, we have a sense on what quality looks like in the lead up to SDG 4, but is inclusion a key part of the conversation? How is it understood and perceived? So starting on the left with a high-level panel, you see that the general focus of this meeting is on the learning crisis. Lots of talk about how we've got a massive learning crisis. There's minimal mentions of barriers. And from a utilitarian perspective, again, they highlight the rate of return on education. Inclusive education is only mentioned once in this document. It's in the appendix, kind of thrown away. Inclusive education is not considered part of quality when you look at definitions of quality. And there are some mentions of all, but they're typically very small and talking about access for all. And really strangely, there's no subgroups identified or targeted, not even gender. We continue on chronologically, we can see that the EFA Steering Committee focuses on a human rights-based approach, specifically emphasizing gender. It does mention some learning outcomes, but also includes not just math and reading, but the importance of creating global citizenship and education for sustainable development. Inclusive education is not mentioned in this document either. But we start to see what will become the overall goal of SDG 4. So inclusive education is part of quality as we are trying to ensure equitable and inclusive quality education and lifelong learning for all by 2030. We have lots of all statements here, and this document focuses on gender and the most marginalized. So we're starting to get a sense on what inclusive education might look like, even though it's not specifically mentioned. The SDSN report, once again, another utilitarian perspective report. We can see that because their focus again is on skills attainment and education for some other end. Again, inclusive education is not considered part of quality in this report. It's not mentioned either. There's some all statements, and that's true in all these reports. And we see an improvement from the high-level panel that there are some identified subgroups talked about in this report. So Muscat, this agreement is one of the big turning points. It enthusiastically endorses a holistic, rights-based approach where education is a fundamental right and essential for lots of things beyond economic outcomes, for peace, for equality, for global citizenship. Again, we see that inclusive education is considered part of quality and one overarching goal, but no mention of inclusive education elsewhere. And following the EFA report, we see an emphasis on girls and the most marginalized. The Open Working Group does focus on poverty eradication, as well as sustainable, inclusive economic growth, and starts to expand what we know as SDG 4.7, looking at gender equality, peace, nonviolence, citizenship. It also introduces Target 4A on inclusive environments, expanding inclusive education as potentially part of quality. We start to see more target subgroups, including Indigenous people, identified as well as gender, disability, and children in vulnerable situations. And we start to see really what we recognize as SDG 4 developed, with specific targets that are talking about all boys and girls or all learners. The synthesis report continues in human rights and trying to combine poverty and human rights, where we're going to end poverty, but we're still going to respect human rights okay. We see a repeat in the overarching goal and in target 4A on inclusive environments. There's not as much here on the synthesis report because the synthesis report is talking about all SDGs. It's not specific to education throughout the full report. And we see a large group of identified populations. Okay, finally we get to entry on declaration, and this is what most civil society points to and what I point to as really the consensus around the Sustainable Development Goal for education. Talks about a renewed educational agenda that is holistic, ambitious, aspirational. No one's left behind. Education's a public good and a fundamental right. And we look at the mentions piece in this table, we can see probably what I think is one of, if not the key statement coming from Incheon, which is that no education target should be considered met unless met by all. So we've got a lot of all statements, but increasingly we've got inclusion talked about as a specific component of quality. And finally, we have the framework for action, which, if you haven't looked at it, is incredibly detailed. And the idea is to take the Sustainable Development Goal for education and provide a first try on how we might measure it, how we might implement it. So here we see for the first time a specific recognition that this is inspired by humanistic vision. And for the first time, we see multiple mentions of inclusive education. Inclusive education should be ensured by designing and implementing transformative public policies to respond to learners' diversity and needs and to address the multiple forms of discrimination in situations. It's not just about integrating people into schools. We need trained teachers. We need to transform the education system. And there's mentions of all throughout the document. Inclusive education is very much considered part of quality at this framework document. So that gets us to the Sustainable Development Goal for education. Now we're going to get into some of the technical pieces, because understanding the difference in some of these technicalities helps me understand why it looks like we should have ended with an inspirational, humanistic, Sustainable Development Goal for education, and we have really a separated approach where inclusion and quality are considered different components. So SDG 4 has 10 targets to it. They're often seen as 4.1 to 4.7 and 4A, B, and C. Some call A, B, and C the means of implementation. Across these 10 targets, there are 11 global indicators. In addition to the 11 global indicators, there are 32 thematic indicators. And these have been created at the global level for countries to report it to a different extent. But they're not the only indicators that were part of the SDG 4 vision. The idea of SDG 4 was, yes, we will have some globally comparable indicators, but countries can adapt to create their own indicators to represent their own values and their own goals. So in addition to the global indicators and the thematic indicators, it was thought that some countries might get together with other countries in their region and create regional indicators that are more important or more valued for that region. In addition, you would have national indicators that might highlight something of great importance for a country or be the country's attempt to adapt global or thematic indicators to really represent the needs of that country. So the big vision of SDG 4 is to have 4 complementary sets of indicators. What we see is really only 2 of those 4 happen. We have the 11 global indicators, and we have the 32 thematic indicators. And really, more than that, the global indicators dominate. They're the ones that get all the attention. Part of that is because of what's required for countries to report. So the only indicators countries are obliged to report on are global indicators. They're also the only indicators typically presented in global reports. If you search websites for SDG 4 indicators, you'll generally only find global indicators. And this means that they are incredibly important, and that the majority of the global and state resources are going to these global indicators, because this is where countries are going to be compared. This is where potential naming and shaming is going to happen. You do not want to look bad on a global indicator. Furthermore, we can see that even though countries are encouraged to report on other indicators, oftentimes their own reports on how they're doing in education in relation to sustainable development goals are focused only on global indicators. So recently, I looked at the voluntary national reviews that were part of the high-level political forum in 2019. So voluntary national reviews, or VNRs, are the way countries report their progress towards the Sustainable Development Goal. They're really interesting documents if you want to see how countries envision and represent themselves. So looking at 32 countries from 2019, at least one country reported on all global indicators. So all the global indicators were covered across this collection of countries. But 14 of the thematic indicators weren't covered by any country. There were no conversations of regional indicators, and there was very little evidence that any country was presenting national indicators or trying to adapt the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals to their country context. So this flexible, inclusive approach to how we can capture the values and aims of countries doesn't seem to be actually coming to fruition. So what we have is a focus on global indicators. And global indicators tend to be narrowed down and really simplified. they fail to capture the essence of the overarching SDG 4 goal and those 10 targets that they're associated with. So SDG 4.1 is the most obvious example of this. So underneath the big, broad SDG 4 goal, the target for SDG 4.1 is humanistic, holistic, really quite beautiful, to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. But when you look at the global indicator for this, and out of all the indicators that could be associated with this target, this is the one that matters for reporting and for resources. We see how simple this is. This is what I would consider a utilitarian, neoliberal economic indicator, where it's only talking about learning outcomes. It's only talking about learning outcomes for a few subjects. And it's only talking about learning outcomes for those in school. SDG 4.1 is not the only target that has been simplified to something that no longer represents what it was designed for. We see that in SDG 4.3, SDG 4.4. We can probably go across all the targets of SDG 4 and do this. So for instance, in SDG 4.4, we're talking about a broad range of technical and vocational skills that are necessary for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. But the global indicator that supposedly captures that target is the proportion of youth and adults with ICT skills. And we look at how this is actually measured. Oftentimes that's, can they copy and paste text? Can they navigate a website? And that is considered to accurately represent the full target for 4.4. So in the creation of the SDGs, we went from this beautiful vision of overlapping complementary indicators to a single powerful global indicator that then warps what was a beautiful humanistic view of education. Some people would say, well, what about SDG 4.7? As somebody who cares about human rights, that's what I'm most interested in. And it is the real transformational part of SDG 4. So talking about what could be different quality education. So the target talks about ensuring all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, the promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and the appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. It's a beautiful and important piece, redefining quality and essential for the future of this planet. Here, we once again have a narrowed view, maybe not quite to the extreme. I think it tries to cling on to some of the humanistic components of its target. So maybe we can say, okay, well, there's enough humanistic left in the global indicator for 4.7 that countries can present themselves in a way that's not strictly utilitarian or neoliberal, is not only limited to learning outcomes, is more inclusive. But when I look back at those 32 countries and I say, okay, what were they presenting on? And this is them presenting global or thematic indicators on any of these targets. We can see that 31 out of 32 countries in their voluntary national review presented information on 4.1. focused on learning outcomes primarily. And then 4.7 had less than 40% of countries present any information, whether it was a global indicator, whether it was something specific to global citizenship or education for sustainable development. Basically, less than 2 out of 5 countries paid any attention to that target. And that's only above 4B, which is an outlier because 4B talks about scholarships and is really only appropriate for donor countries that are providing scholarships. So we see, okay, 4.7 is different, but it doesn't capture the same energy, the same momentum. It's not mentioned the same way as other targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we've seen here is we have a broad humanistic goal. We typically have humanistic, rights-based targets that are aspirational, inspiring. But as we've gone from the target to the global indicator, education somehow has been captured by a utilitarian view. So why is that? So first, there's some civil society fatigue. There's huge efforts to mobilize and organize, especially before Muscat and Incheon, and push for a transformational agenda for education. This is one of my favorite quotes from Incheon, where transformative public policies are needed to respond to learners' diversity and needs, and to address the multiple forms of discrimination and of situations, including emergencies, which impede the fulfillment of the right to education. But there's some concern whether or not Incheon was the moment for civil society. All of the effort and resources went into building towards that to ensure that we have a humanistic top line for education, to see inclusion as part of the overarching goal for education. Was the mission accomplished by ensuring we've got a humanistic approach to this high-level discourse? Maybe the fact that civil society, being primarily a rights-based movement, is fatigued. Part of the reason that a utilitarian approach is able to kind of sneak in there. The second reason we see a utilitarian approach taking over the Sustainable Development Goals is the operationalization process, or how we've gone from big ideas on education to how do we measure education. The need at a global level for quantifiable, comparable indicators. And as we went from Incheon and the framework for action to writing indicators, developing indicators that are measurable and comparable, we saw a very different group take part. The leaders for developing global indicators included 27 national statistical offices led by a United Nations chair. In addition to this technical transformation, there's huge investment going towards learning outcomes, huge attention being put on a learning crisis. So donors specifically are searching for easily communicated ways to measure impact. There's a huge pool of donor support going towards addressing the learning crisis, a narrow view of quality education. And this includes results-based financing for development agencies like the United Nations DFID, which in the early 2010s was providing funding to some countries based on whether or not they're participating in tests and how well they've done on those tests. And now UIS, or the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, which is overseeing this whole indicator creation process, is getting funding that's earmarked only for measuring learning outcomes. So donors are going to them saying, if you are going to take this money, it's only to be used for measuring learning outcomes. That's clear in how SDG 4.1 has changed since 2015. So part of the UNESCO Institute of Statistics goal for creating indicators and how they've gone about that is by creating something called GAML. And GAML is the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning. It's a self-funded group under UIS tasked at created indicators for all targets that are associated with learning. And those have been identified as 4.1, 4.2, 4.4, 4.6, and 4.7. Because it is a self-funded group, however, donors play a huge role in what the indicators end up looking like. The largest supporters of GAML is once again the United Nations Development Agency, DFID, Australia's development agency, DFAT, and the Hewlett Foundation. So GAML is supposed to be developing things for 4.1 and all these other targets that have something to do with learning. But when we look at what's happening in GAML, that's not typically the case. 4.1 is prioritized. When we look at their results framework, we see that 2 out of every 3 targets within this group focus on 4.1. That means 1 out of every 3 targets focus on the other 4 goals: 4.2, 4.4, 4.6, and 4.7. There's been huge money and resources put into this by donors. So since 2015, the United Nations DFID has put over 10 million pounds into UIS in order to create learning outcome metrics. If we look at the figure here, we can see that in 2015, the target and global indicator for SDG 4.1 was at the same level as the global indicator for SDG 4.7. So the 4.1 being often associated with a really utilitarian neoliberal perspective, and 4.7 being the representative of a humanistic approach. In 2015, they're at the same level. They're both considered a tier 3 indicator, which means nobody knows how they're going to measure it. There is not an established methodology. It's aspirations for both of them. In 2018, however, we see that all the resources and funding has changed things. The importance of SDG 4.1 is now clear. And in 2019, it's identified as a tier 1 indicator, which meant the global indicator is now conceptually clear. They worked hard to create an established methodology, and they can now collect that information from over 130 countries around the world. That's in sharp contrast to 4.7, which saw no growth, no change in their methodology over a 4-year period. And this is in part because they're underfunded, undersupported, and not where donors are investing their money. So another reason why we've got this disjunction between a humanistic view of the SDG 4 goal and targets and a utilitarian approach to global indicators, because when you look back at those 8 meetings before SDG 4, inclusive education at that point is really just seen as integration. The only time inclusive education is mentioned explicitly is at the very end. Inclusive education is generally not mentioned anywhere else out of those 7 documents. There is no alternative definition of quality from what is being captured by the utilitarian approach. There's missing in these 8 documents leading up to SDG 4 is recognition that it's not getting students into the door that matters by itself, that there are pedagogical approaches used in inclusive education that benefit all learners. The large principles of inclusive education are not discussed in these 8 documents, and therefore somewhat forgotten. As I mentioned, what we do have are these notions of integration into the system. But once again, we have learners accessing and then having to adapt to the system instead of a system that changes and adapts to meet the needs of all learners. What we have in these 8 documents, in these important meetings leading up to SDG 4, are a bunch of all statements. We need to ensure all children, regardless of circumstance, are able to enroll and complete a full course of primary and lower secondary education. Equitable access to education for children, youth, and adults should be provided for all and at all levels of education. And these are important and good statements. There's nothing wrong with these. The challenge is, this is it for inclusion in many of these meetings. It is just, let's get everybody into the school. It doesn't care what happens necessarily in that school. And that's not saying that the civil society movement doesn't care, but that's not captured in the outputs of these meetings. It's just, can we put everybody in the same boat? But we don't care necessarily where the boat goes. As long as everybody is included, the ultimate destination doesn't matter. And what that's allowed is a moment for those with a different perspective on education, a utilitarian view of quality, to decide the direction of education, to steer the boat. This is part of what some might talk about as a difference between principle and practice. At the global level, ideas like equity and inclusion and quality, they can all live peacefully. We can talk about how we need it all, how they're all complementary. We don't need to compromise. There doesn't need to be any hierarchy of principles. But when we go from this global idea of principles to what does it mean in reality, how do we put this in practice? How do we operationalize the Sustainable Development Goals and make them measurable? How do we implement them at the national and local level? We start to see that in practice, these principles are thrust into competition with each other. And therefore, there's a sense on, well, do we care more about learning outcomes Do we care more about inclusive pedagogy? Are we caring more about learning environments? And you start to see some cost-benefit analysis and some hierarchy developing over what's more important in practice. And what we've seen is that the principles, the beautiful aspiration of SDG 4 has not played out in practice. That there's really minimal attention given to inclusion and equity, where inclusion and equity and equality are now seen as separate from each other. Quality has been captured by utilitarian perspective, and inclusion and equity are left to compete with each other for whatever resources are remaining. So at the end, where we're currently at is a refragmentation of inclusive education. For 30 years leading up to SDG 4, we saw a movement towards a broader consensus on what inclusive education is and can be. But in this technical process of emphasizing global indicators, narrowing down and capturing quality from a utilitarian perspective, inclusive education has been reduced to the narrow definition it had at the beginning, to disaggregation of a few identified groups. Within SDG 4, we see prioritized groups being gender, income, location, and when possible, disability. And this is clear when we look at global reports. So on the right side, we see, and these are important, they've got good insights to them, but they're limited. On the right side, we see information coming from UNESCO Institute of Statistics. This is from their document leading to the 2019 High-Level Political Forum, which is where all those voluntary national reviews were inputting into. And this is how they've captured inclusive. Basically, let's take things and separate them by wealth, location, and sex. We'll talk about access to education and education completion by a limited number of demographic groups. On the left side, we see one of the tables from the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is a UNESCO report that came out this year, focusing on inclusion in education. So my guess is that a good amount of you are familiar with this, but if you haven't, I would encourage you to take a look at the report. Here we see a couple of important trends. So looking at school attendance, once again, this is initial access, not what goes on in the school. And we can see that there are other groups that are identified here. So in addition to location, in addition to wealth, in addition to sex, here we see information on difference by language or difference by ethnicity. And the GEM report can do this in a table like this because all they're doing is looking at a specific country. So this isn't a comparable version of indicators. They're trying to highlight that there are other important things to do and look at. But at the end, a more complex view that recognizes things are different at different levels with a large variety of groups gets simplified to something like we see on the right. And both of these are missing the broader picture of what inclusive education really looks like. It's assuming that if we get people into the school door, we've met our goal. So now, as I said, these are important and they can bring some benefits, these disaggregated results, by highlighting the rights of marginalized groups. We talked about here, even though kind of the utilitarian perspective shifts the focus from enabling conditions and quality teaching to test scores and privilege criteria. Disaggregated data can be beneficial to shine a light on the distinct challenges faced by marginalized and excluded children. And there's some great work being done at the global level to better highlight some of these marginalized groups. So the Washington Group on Disability Statistics is trying to create a range of question sets with some more or less comparable across countries that capture individual functioning. And so far, they've been relatively successful. Over 70 countries have used one of their question sets and put it into their census so we have better information. So I'm not here talking about we need less information or we need worse information, all for good information across different groups. But from an education perspective, it can't just be let's get different groups into the school door. So what we're seeing here is, at the end, really competing discourses, where quality and inclusion are separated. As Fleas pointed out, when more humanistic values of education, such as inclusion and equity, are forced to compete against others, they're often inaudible. They're drowned out. They can't be seen or heard. Alan points out that an overemphasis on testing and related competition have been recognized as undermining countries' efforts to promote a social inclusion agenda and is actively contributing to inequalities. So to some extent, Alan would say this is worse than just separating inclusion and quality, that the capture of quality by a utilitarian perspective and the emphasis in a utilitarian perspective on narrow views of quality as testing and competition actually undermines earlier efforts for inclusive education and can contribute to inequality. So finally, what we need here, and what I think part of this conference is about, is a call for action, right? Bringing together like-minded individuals to recognize the importance and see how we can make change in our communities and in our countries. There needs to be an increased effort to position inclusion back at the heart of quality. You can't have quality separate from inclusion. There is no quality without inclusion. And this is, to UNESCO's credit, reflected in the recommendations of their Global Education Monitoring Report for this year, which talks about a broad definition of inclusion, where it should be about all learners, regardless of identity, background, or ability. Underneath this, which is their first recommendation from this report, they talk about the importance of not discriminating or rejecting anyone, having coherent education planning at all levels and across ministries, adjusting education to meet diverse needs of learners. It's not about learners changing to meet education, and working towards gender equality. What we need for this, on our final slide, sorry, let me get back to that, is really a renewed collective effort bringing together the inclusive education community and providing a message that goes beyond access for all and goes beyond learning for all. It's not just about learning outcomes. That's not the sole purpose of education. And really, this message discusses what an inclusive education fully looks like. So that requires an emphasis and some additional evidence demonstrating the relationship between inclusive practices and pedagogy and quality education for all. And as I've mentioned, quality is not possible without genuine, authentic inclusion. So that is the end of my talk. I want to thank you all for this. As I mentioned, this is part of a chapter I'm developing with Chris Johnstone, an inclusive education expert at the University of Minnesota. So I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you all for joining me today and taking some time to listen to what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. William C. Smith. That was very much an in-depth presentation, very impressive, and has a lot of details for our consumption. Thank you very much for your presentation and your time. We really enjoyed the great lessons and the recommendations as well. So at this juncture, we move on into the questions and answers session, of which I believe that you are ready for. Are we ready, please?
Oh, yes, let's go.
Okay, thank you. Before I read out my first question, I would like to encourage each and everybody present here
Oh, I think we're stuck.
watched, listened, and read. Thank you. So my first question to you, Mr. William, I have a question from someone, and it says that how is UNESCO holding stakeholders and governments accountable for inclusive education for the 185 countries that have signed this inclusive education treaties? Did you get that, sir?
Yes, so thank you for the question.
Thank you.
So when we think about either UNESCO or UN conventions or the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a variety of different accountability avenues that individual communities and even global actors can take. So UNESCO, what they're doing, let's stick with the Sustainable Development Goals for now. So they have, in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, when you look at the different documents leading up to SDG 4, it's interesting that initially UNESCO wanted to have fairly strong language on accountability. They wanted to have an accountability mechanism, and accountability was mentioned in some of the early documents leading up to SDG 4. However, as it went through kind of the country level authorization process, the language around accountability really weakened. And what we ended up with is a high-level political forum and a voluntary national review process. So now the sense is that the way countries are being held accountable for inclusive education, for SDG 4, is by being strongly encouraged by the global community to submit voluntary national reviews, at which point them and their partner countries then reflect on those and provide recommendations. Now, the voluntary national reviews have been captured by, I think, in the first 5 years, about 70% of countries have participated. But they're big countries and important countries that haven't. So Russia has not submitted something, which for inclusive education is pretty important. You think about some of the challenges for inclusive education in Russia. The United States has not participated, even before the first year before Trump administration came into power, did not participate in the voluntary national review process. And there are also resource constraints to making this voluntary. It means that there's no funding support for this type of mechanism. So a lot of small countries, a lot of the small island developing countries are left out and haven't participated in this process. So there are some real weaknesses, and part of that is because as we've moved and made this a country-led process, the Sustainable Development Goals, countries have been really reluctant to having a strong accountability measure part of the SDGs. And as a voluntary process, a lot of the emphasis then goes on countries that want to participate and some that choose not to. Potentially those with some of the largest problems in inclusive education are not participating. Some without resources are not participating. So there's some real issues there. One other final thing before the next question. When we have a UN convention, whether this is the Convention on the Rights of the Child or other UN conventions, persons with disabilities, there's often a individual complaint mechanism that individuals within the country, if they are not being remedied at the national level, could go through follow-up. And so while I was at the Global Education Monitoring Report, we outlined some of these different mechanisms, and the 2017 and 18 monitoring report on accountability. And if you're interested specifically in gender as part of inclusion, you would probably want to look at the gender report there, because we worked with the Right to Education initiative to look at how can individuals who aren't being heard from their governments file complaints at a global level. So I hope that addresses some of those questions.
Thank you so much for that great answer. We move on to our next question. And I have a question here for me. And are there any positive developments regarding building strong network of collaborators to push for inclusion and equity in resource allocation for deaf and hearing young learners?
That's a good question. I am not as familiar with that specific group within inclusive education. So I know that there are a different set of networks and that on inclusive education, and that we are meeting with some of those in the creation of the 2020 GEM report. So I was meeting with different inclusive education experts in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere that were feeding into the concept notes that helped create this report for UNESCO. So there is some momentum with that. I'm not saying momentum is dead, but I'm concerned that the kind of combined power of inclusive education is now fragmented to the point where we've got different special interest groups all fighting for resources as quality's been captured by really a strong set of stakeholders that speak the needs of donors. So there's limited resources available, and that as what are some fairly powerful within their sector, special interest groups, that instead of combining and reshaping quality at a global level, that we're seeing them kind of compete for attention and compete for resources. Yeah, so sorry I can't give you a more direct answer on that. It's not quite an area that I do a lot of work in.
That's fine, thank you. Everything you said also actually made a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I move to my next question, and that is coming from Dr. Cara McBride. And she says, thank you. That was a great presentation to you. But she has a question. It is basically asking you, Mr. Bill, to restart part of your main points. Okay, so Dr. McBride wants you to give us bullet points of your main actual presentations. You had
Yeah.
me right.
Well, thank you. I realized, especially as I was going through
Sorry.
this. Oh, go ahead.
Just not the whole presentation, but just that sort of the piece there when it comes to, I mean, I love the part where you were talking about how quality and inclusion have been sort of re-separated from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just myself, I feel at moments that I really fully understand, especially in communicating to other people, you know, how that is so necessary for any type of child, even if they have no disability and they have all kinds of, you know, whatever kind of circumstance they may be in.
Yes.
But the argument for the importance of recognizing those two being naturally having to go together is usually done from the point of view of children with disabilities. And I wondered if you could sort of help me think of ways of formulating that, you know, not from starting from that point of view, but from children who don't have disabilities.
Yeah. So I think we think about inclusion as central to quality. You're right that oftentimes it's talked about as, well, it benefits those with disabilities. And when I was talking at the end about really more emphasis and research needs to be focused on the benefits of an inclusive school for everybody beyond children with disabilities. I think that there is some research out there that focuses on some minor gains in learning outcomes, some minor gains in perhaps acceptance measures. When we talk about that, I mean, the more diverse your classroom, your school is, and so forth, the more likely you're able to recognize those and take on and empathize with what would be considered the other in other parts of the community and society. So I do think there's some benefits to that. I think that to some extent we do that in the 2020 GEM report, where we try to highlight benefits for non-disabled groups. The challenge is oftentimes it's, well, these really benefit those with disabilities and it doesn't harm others. And I think that if we think beyond learning outcomes and we think about other measures of acceptance and inclusion and kind of are able to get around some of those ideas in 4.7 as the key outcomes for education, we're going to see more benefits for an inclusive approach. But it is a hard thing to argue. I mean, part of me would say the simple message is, if it benefits some students and doesn't harm others, then that seems like an obvious investment. So yeah, I mean, it's a challenging argument to make. So best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We move to our very next question as well. Then my question is, what has been your assessment of how countries have bridged the gap of inclusive and equitable learning opportunities for the deaf and hearing young learners?
Okay, so there are some, I think, creative ways that we are trying to accommodate learning at different levels. So that includes, so I was in Nigeria a couple years ago, and includes more audible books or tactile books, and recognizing that it's important to communicate in a variety of ways. So the 2020 GEM report on inclusive education is the first report available in Braille. So I think a couple things. First, we need to recognize that just because they have kind of these special needs doesn't mean that they are incapable of learning. In fact, they're just as sharp, just as bright, just as capable of learning as anybody else, but that we need to be able to communicate our lessons, communicate pedagogically in a different way. So I do think there's an increased accommodation, but the accommodation that I'm seeing, and it's part of just because I focus on testing and quality, is around how do we ensure that there's additional time? How do we ensure that there's additional communication? Because the only way we're going to see at the global level the learning crisis decrease is if we end up with individuals scoring better on a test, because that's the only way we're measuring learning. Some of the big steps forward, I think, in learning for everybody is the ability to capture learning in the home. So I think some of the more community-based assessments that are being done in different countries to try to really understand what is learning like for everyone, even if you don't go to school every day. So we know that some students with special needs are less likely to go to school or less likely to go to school every day. We also know that in large assessments, international assessments, even national assessments, students with special needs are more likely to be excluded from that assessment. So having household or community-based assessment is one way we can actually capture everybody to understand what the needs are of all of our students, all of our children, and then do some adapting there. So I do think there's some creative ways that we're doing a better job of communicating, and that moving how we're measuring learning from a national school-based model to a household model that's capturing everybody is an important part of inclusion.
Thank you very much. I still want to probe in more.
Yeah,
And so on that note, I would like to know, where does Africa rank in addressing inclusiveness and equitable
oh, I think we're stuck.
learners?
Oh,
Hello, Mr. Smith?
yeah, sorry, you got stuck there for a second. So you asked about where do I see Africa?
Please.
Sorry, I'm not getting you very well. So what I thought I heard was, can I say more about where I see Africa and ensuring inclusive and equitable education? Is that close? Should I speak to that?
Okay. Rank in addressing inclusiveness, equitable opportunity for young deaf and hearing learners.
Okay. I didn't quite get all that either, but I'm going to give a little bit, and then please feel free to probe more if I misunderstood.
Okay.
So my sense on Africa is, first, I mean, obviously recognizing that Africa is incredibly diverse with lots of different approaches to inclusive education. And so when we look at different parts of Africa, whether it's Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, other areas that I'm somewhat familiar with, I think what we're still seeing is a slower movement from what I would say as kind of the narrow definition to the broad definition, where in parts of the world, there isn't a parallel education system. There aren't necessarily special schools. That there is a sense that we are bringing everybody into the mainstream to have the same experience. Parts of Africa and parts of other places in the world as well are still, I think, looking at a narrow approach to inclusive education, where there are parallel systems. And I think one thing we've learned is that parallel systems don't really mean we've got equality, kind of highlights our differences. I don't think that actually fully answers your question, Christabel, because I wasn't quite able to hear the full thing. I apologize. I think we might be frozen again.
Hello.
Apologies for the network glitches. Thank you so much. I think Christabel is having a few issues, so we are going to wait to see if she comes back in the next minute, and then we continue to the next section. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lily. Sounds good.
Thank you so much, Will, for this session. It's been really great. We appreciate the details you have given us today. And I know that, the reason why this forum has been created is also to give us an understanding of how we can make sure that inclusion and quality are put together in our various classrooms, in the various education programs that we are offering in our communities and in our various countries. So thank you so much for touching a lot on that. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I think Christabel is still having issues. And so I don't think I really need any introduction to go into my session. My name is Lily Kudzro, and sorry, give me 1 second. Christabel, are you okay? Okay, so I'll go ahead and continue. I'll introduce myself, I guess. Apologies for that. So Once again, my name is Lily Kudzro. I'm the founder of Debut Early Childhood Institute in Ghana. And Debut has been established since 2014. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Can you see my screen, everybody? Hello?
I can't see it yet.
You can see? Okay, sorry. Awesome. So thank you so much. Once again, my name is Lily, and I would like to talk a little bit about what we do at Debut Early Childhood Institute. So our work is to transform the way young children learn, more especially with the way they process and relate with the education being offered them. So we focus more on the process of the education that children receive more than the outcome. When I was listening to Will's, presentation, he talked a lot about that. He even made emphasis to how children are placed at the door and expected that, okay, once, we place them at the door, then, we have achieved inclusion. But there is more to it because, working with children and teachers over the 6 years period that our organization has been in existence, we have realized that various children learn in different ways. So there is the need to focus more on the process-based learning than just offering children a test kind of educational process. So that is what we've been doing with Debut, and we didn't start, fighting for deaf inclusion and things like that from the beginning. We started just with having a program for children and wanting to change, the process that and innovate learning for children, more especially in Ghana and in West Africa. And then we advanced into teacher training programs because we realized that, education is not really impactful if the teachers that deliver the education are not well equipped with the resources and the skills to really deliver the education to children. And one of the major challenges we have in Ghana is that early childhood education especially is not really given that kind of attention because we believe it's more like a place where children go whilst their working parents go to work. And we will attest that globally that phenomenon of early childhood is changing. And so, which is why we have also decided to increase the projection of our work to what we do with teachers, and then also ensure that we can fill the gap of that, problem. We can be able to solve the issue of lack of skilled teachers in our region. So we train teachers in various capacity building workshops and also strengthen them with various resources and innovative ideas on ways that they can really excel and make sure that the education they are offering these children is something that the children can really rely on even in the future. So we work with local and international experts in education, in early childhood education, in inclusive education to make sure that the kind of training we are offering them is holistic and is also effective. So over the years, before introducing the sign language concept, we didn't know how exciting, teaching children with disabilities and children without disabilities is. And apart from the excitement, it's also about the kind of impact that it brings to all children. So in 2015, this, I would like to share my own personal story and how DeView, decided to embark on the journey of promoting national sign languages. So we had a center and we have a deaf child working to one of our programs. And I realized it was really difficult to really communicate with her because, most of the programs, when we started was just targeted as, children without disabilities. And our engagement with her really was what brought us onto this path, on this path of knowing that, when we engage children with disabilities, along with children without disabilities, apart from offering these children with disabilities the opportunity to receive education, the children without disabilities also at the end are impacted in various ways. So for instance, we have children without disabilities learning to be, like each other's keeper, becoming more empathetic, engaging more because they want to support. And that is how children are. They don't really care about the disabilities of other children they play with. They don't care about, what those children cannot, they just want to play and have fun together. And those really made us see the impacts that these two groups of children really can have together. And which is why we started our campaign to promote national sign languages, to support deaf children whose issues are actually just with communication, right? Because the only problem deaf children have is with the communication process. They're really intelligent kids. When you engage deaf children, you realize that, they are children with, very great energy. They want to really enjoy life just like any other child would be. So, this is something that we all need to consider and push for children, because communication is key, and understanding these communication and processing them is the beginning of learning for even both deaf and hearing children. So this year, one of the programs that we also decided to really push to get, to work with lots of people, individuals, and organizations at the grassroots level was the Global Sign Challenge, because we realized that all around the world, people who are using their national sign languages to really make a difference in the life of children are not really receiving the support that they need. And also, these people who are needed to be pulled along the decision-making process are left behind. And with the Global Sign Challenge, we launched this competition to celebrate and support these grassroots stakeholders like teachers, parents, and families who are using their sign languages to support children's learning. We received amazing entries from people from all over Italy, Malawi, from Ghana, from Kenya, Uganda, and this shows us that there is really work that is being done underground. But these people are not in the limelight. Nobody hears about them. Nobody sees what they are doing. No data is available because it is not an area that is really considered a kind of priority at the moment when you look at global education and even education in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the goal of this challenge is also, to further the development, awareness, and appreciation of national, regional, and local sign languages, to promote creativity and originality in interacting with and supporting young children's learning. Promote inclusion of deaf children in EC programs. Again, that is because we realize that once the communication gap is bridged, deaf children can reach their full potentials like every other children in this world. Also, the competition is to increase access to inclusive language opportunities for all children. So for instance, it is estimated that about 7% of hearing children have speech and language delay issues. And these are things that we have really ignored because there are some services like speech and language therapy services and things. But when you come to West Africa, when you come to Sub-Saharan Africa, in low-income communities and middle-income communities, these kind of services cannot really be afforded, right? So, why not introduce our national sign languages, which are even derived from our spoken languages, to bridge these gaps and ensure that even the 7% of the hearing children who are also having speech and language delay issues would also receive the support that they need. I don't know if mostly, any of you would attest to it, but I have raised a male child, and I've seen that most male children really, in the beginning, have a lot of language delay issues, compared to girls. And so this is a major problem for even hearing children. It's not just about deaf children. And again, our national sign languages are derived from our natural spoken languages. So it's like teaching our children our local languages. And that has actually gestures, it has, you have to sign symbols and things. That really makes the whole communication process truly inclusive and engaging. And this really even helps when you come to how children can remember. It helps in, improving their critical thinking skills, their creativity skills. Because when you combine these signing, when you look at the interpreters we have on the screen, Francis and Clement, they are combining their hands, movements, and things like this. And all these really contribute to making, increasing children's motor skills, and a lot of things that are really important for all children, not just deaf children. So actually bringing our national sign languages into our classrooms is like creating a better future for all children, not just for deaf children. And then again, we are achieving inclusive education and quality education in the same time. So we also work in various advocacy and community outreach interventions with our work, and trying to bridge the serious gaps in early childhood education. So how do we do this? We identify the prevalent gaps that prevent children from learning and succeeding in their studies. So like I said, before we started this whole promoting sign languages things, we identified these issues, and we realized that these are things that don't just exist in our local communities. This is something that exists on the regional level. It exists at the global level, at the national level, and in every household. So we went into looking more into the issue, researching and finding out existing resources and policies to address these challenges. And that is what we do. We identify, research, and see if there are already existing innovative approaches to solve some of these problems. Apart from looking for innovative approaches, we also designed some of these innovative ideas to see what is the best way to really tackle inclusion for all children. What is the best way to solve the problem that we have identified? Because, as parents or as educators, we all want to make sure that we are creating a future that our children will not have to suffer in the future. We're creating a future that is inclusive, a society that will accept all of us for who we are. And that goes into the research part, because we also want to make sure that whatever innovation that we bring out is something that is going to be sustainable. It's going to be an innovation or an approach that is going to be, at the end of the day, also realistic. It's going to be achievable. And even though it may be difficult, we can still see that it is something that is going to be viable. And we also, through this research stage, we compare the SDGs, just like Will has explained and everything. And we also look at the national level, the various countries. What are some of the policies that our various countries have ratified? And Will mentioned in his presentation that These treaties have been signed by about 185 countries. There are a total of 195 countries in the world. So if 185 countries have ratified policies to push for inclusive education, when are we going to start really implementing these strategies? So during the research phase, we consider all these things and also look at the gaps that are existing. For instance, the 2020 UNESCO GEM report touches a lot about only 46 countries out of these 195 countries, recognizing and using their national sign languages, which is not even up to like 50% of the number of countries that we have. So we look at also stakeholders like the big giant philanthropic organizations, during the research phase, and also see what has been some of the work that they have put in and addressing some of these challenges that we have identified. And we see if we can, pull them along, collaborate with them, collaborate with local actors, collaborate with people like you who is joining us today to really create a better solution. And then we hung our voices until we see change. So we kind of hold governments, leaders, and stakeholders accountable. We do this through petitions, through programs like Iiecef 2020, just to make sure that we can bring leaders in the governments and stakeholders along to the kind of progress that we want to bring. We want to draw the attention because, sometimes even though we have identified and done our research and seen the gaps, and we have also seen some of the positive impacts that these innovative ideas could bring, governments need to be held accountable. Leaders need to, even we as individuals, civil society organizations as well, needs to be held accountable. So this is what we do in the honking through the advocacy stage, in pushing and ensuring that these solutions that we are using that are really working can also be scaled. And we take positive action by creating change in our community, pulling along and others along and working with individuals, friends, teachers, families, and everyone to ensure that this, program or this goal of ensuring that the future of learning is inclusive for all children can be successful. So I want to pause here and invite you to really, I have a few questions for you. The first one is, how will we communicate in the future? If you can post in the chat pod, how you think we will be communicating in the future. We have listened to Will, he's talked about the SDGs, and these SDGs govern most of policies around the world, around education and all this. So in your view, how do you think we will communicate in the future? And how will children learn in the future? Will we communicate inclusively as a society? Are we cheering to that point? Do you think that we are growing to the point as a society for children to learn inclusively in the future? I want to hear your views and your perspective on that. And if you can help me, Christabel, with reading some of the chats, I would appreciate it.
Okay. Sorry for the earlier challenges. I'm having a little bit of challenges here. It's raining heavily here, so there is an interruption in the network as well. So I'm really sorry for that, and I hope I will be forgiven. Thank you all for still staying put and enjoying Lily's presentation, just as I did. So I'm trying to get some of the questions from the chat session. We are all encouraged as well to share our thoughts and our comments and as well our questions for Lily. I'm very sure she is really gingered up to answer all those questions.
Well,
For the
I would
meantime,
go on if there are no really any perspectives or anything. But the next thing I
okay,
will
but
say,
let me ask this question, then you can go on ahead and continue with your presentation whilst they come up. We'd like
sure.
to know from you what have been some of your challenges in terms of advocating for such impactful initiative, advocating for an inclusive language.
Well, I think there's been a lot of challenges, but I would definitely like to touch more on that at the end of the presentation. So if there is nobody who is really,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. Jody, Dr. Jody has something for you. And his question is, what is your vision for training? That is his first question. And I
Okay.
think when you finish with that, I can then move on to his second question.
Sure. So actually, just to let you know, I'm not done with my presentation. I just wanted to
Okay.
have this interaction session with you whilst we move on. So Jody, thank you so much for your question. I would move into that towards the end of the presentation. The next thing, the reason why I asked these two questions, how will we communicate in the future? And how will children learn in the future? Is just for you to understand that we as a society and as a world in general, we are gearing towards an inclusive future where communication will be inclusive, where children will learn in an inclusive environment. Children with disabilities will learn with children without disabilities. So that is where we're headed. So we cannot, as leaders and as stakeholders, as parents, as educators, as families, as community members, we cannot postpone inclusive education for children because we are gearing towards that future. So the better we act, the better it is for us. Now, I also want to talk about my next slide, which is, a lot of us are expecting governments and major world leaders, right, to take action. That is true. And that is awesome. We need to hold our leaders and stakeholders accountable. But governments and world leaders are currently focused on creating jobs, growing the economies. And now, with the existing pandemic, leaders are more focused on dealing with the pandemic and saving lives. Inclusion and more so early childhood education or inclusive early childhood education is not their priority unless we all stand up and take action. Governments want to hold power. And yes, these things that they want to solve, like, solving climate change issues, growing economies, creating jobs, they are excellent. But if all these are in place and the future leaders that we are nurturing for tomorrow to really take up these things that we have built are not fully prepared, then we will still have done nothing in the future because education is the first foundation for a successful future. And whether we like it or not, children with disabilities and children without disabilities all make together a great nation. And so we need to make sure that we support. My next slide is about everyone must take action. So there is the need for early years centers to employ deaf people to work with teachers in offering sign language in their programs. I think Alanis talked about this yesterday when he, in his presentation about building the early childhood workforce. And he even mentioned that, deaf teachers or deaf youth people can still teach in a school where there are no, you know, deaf children or there are no interpreters. This is possible. So we are looking forward to you as an educator or you as a community member, you as a teacher or as a family member or as a mother or as a parent to really create this and make sure this is possible in your own way, in your community. So early years centers, we are counting on you to employ deaf people to work with teachers in offering sign language in their programs. Governments and leaders also must invest in inclusive early childhood education and also create job opportunities for the youth who want to venture into sign language programs, and also for the numerous of deaf youths who are unemployed. When you come to our Ghanaian community, for instance, most of the deaf youth are not able to access job opportunities. They either have to go back to maybe teaching in the teacher training schools, and continue, the cycle continues the same way. But once these communication barriers are bridged, there is a lot of beauty that our community and our society can be. There's a lot of progress that we can see when we ensure that all persons are able to contribute. And these deaf young people and children with disabilities, there are great things that these people can contribute to growing our world, to changing our world and making it a better place for us all. And then as nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, we must also increase investment in inclusive early childhood education and also in advocacy campaigns to educate and inform people on the use and recognition of their sign languages. Individuals, parents and teachers, and even you who has joined us for Iiecef today, we all must play our role to support inclusive language accessibility for children. For instance, parents should be open and share and receive information to help their deaf and hearing children. So I mean, if you are a parent with hearing children, you have to be open to receive information about how your children can adapt to an environment, an educational system that has other children with disabilities learning alongside with them. You need to be prepared for that because we are gearing towards a future that is inclusive. As a parent with a deaf or a child with disability, you need to be open to share your data, your how you were doing this, how the kind of information you're using, to even be open to receive information as well, so that you can raise your children in an environment and to be able to impact their future in a very great and awesome way. There is also the need to increase access to sign language books and resources, because we can train teachers, we can introduce sign language, but if there are no accessible books and resources, this process will also be difficult. So some of the great examples are the All Children Reading Project that is working with various organizations like Iiecef in Kenya, the RIT, which has the World Around You platform. And what they basically do is, they have books that are translated and made in video formats that you can use to teach children. We also had yesterday Ivo from Huawei doing a presentation on the StorySign app. And there are a lot of books. I think they have about 32 books now in their collection of books for the StorySign project. And these are resources that we can all take advantage of to expand these inclusive language pedagogy movements, if you want, I can call it that way, or to really ensure that this whole inclusive education approach is holistic and successful. There is lack of data. So especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there is lack of recorded data from schools, families, and even civil society organizations to really help identify the best way to tackle some of these evidence gaps, and also in scaling up the solutions that are working. So when I talked about the Global Sign Challenge, when I went through some of the entries, we realized that there are people who are doing amazing and wonderful work around the world, but these people are not being recognized. The approaches, nobody really knows it because these data are not available. They are not recorded, and these cannot be scaled because nobody is hearing about it. So we need to do more in making data accessible and available, and making sure that we can also use some of these data to scale the existing approaches that are working. So we need data from teachers who engage children daily. We need data from parents and families with deaf children, and even parents with children with speech and language delay issues, and families with hearing children who are using their national sign languages or even other approaches to support the language development and learning of children. Data is also needed from civil society and local education and community focus groups. The 2020 GEM report really highlights, the really serious gaps in not being able to get data on some of these important issues. And so even if UNESCO wants to touch and highlight some of these things without them having data from those people working at the grassroots level, it's going to be really difficult for some of these stakeholders to also really invest because there is no available data. So they don't even know if it's a critical niche that they need to address or if it actually even needs to be supported at all. So thank you so much. I'm almost to the end, but I got a surprise for everybody. As a pledge from Devio, we want to pledge towards inclusive early childhood education. And we want to encourage each and everybody to do the same. So we want you to share your pledge of what you're going to do from here to promote your national sign language in your classroom, your home or community, and get a chance to win $500. Those of you participating in this forum are the first to actually hear this. So all you have to do is sign our ongoing petition to the GPE to introduce sign languages in the programs that they fund in various countries. Follow us on Devio Early Childhood Institute on Twitter and tag us in your tweet on how you will promote your national sign language in the early years in your community. So you also need to tag, because this is more like a Twitter advocacy campaign, we need you to tag us and tag the organizations that you also want to pull along with you to achieve this goal, right? And so yeah, you're welcome to start tweeting. So you can also add hashtag Storate, hashtag inclusive early childhood education, hashtag promoting national sign languages in the early years. And this campaign is going to run from now to March 31st. The tweets with the highest engagement will be awarded the $500 prize. And this is just to, it's just the beginning of our pledge towards inclusive language opportunities for children around the world, because we know that once we are able to all contribute in our own very small ways, deaf children and hearing children can learn together and achieve their full potential in life. It is possible. And thank you so much once again for joining us and believing in us, participating in the forum. So I would go ahead and take questions now, Christabel, if there are any questions for me.
Okay, yes, I have a couple of questions for you myself. Thank you so much for the great presentation. And before we move into the question session, I would like to encourage that for us to really win this prize, if you can share this information and then the link into the chat session so that people can start, signing and activating it as soon as possible. Thank you. So we move on to the questions session. Early on, we had a question from William Smith for our first speaker for today. And he says, regarding children learning in the future, 2 quick thoughts. One, perhaps a big opportunity for more children voices as youth are taking leading role in social justice activities, into brackets, thinking about climate, racial justice. And the second point is, can we capture the benefits or positive new approaches that may have been developed during the pandemic? So that is a question, and also some thoughts from Mr. Will Smith, who happened to be our first speaker for today. Would you like to share some thoughts on it, please?
I think Will is he says perhaps a big opportunity for more children voice as youth are taking lead role in social justice activities. Yes, and that is truly a great point, because the more we have young people really join in pushing some of these things, the more we will be successful. The more young people are able to add their voices, the more change, or the more impact we can make. So yes, that is truly great. And yes, we can also capture the benefits and positive new approaches. And the pandemic is also one of the things that has really opened our eyes, because when we look at how we all have to use mask and have to cover our mouths and everything, right? Sign languages can really be effective, if there wouldn't be any issue with the communication process, because at this point we everybody is covering their mouths, everybody is limiting the way they talk and everything. And sign languages is one of the ways of communication that can also actually articulate the information we want to put across. So the benefits of sign languages is in a lot of ways. And I will say that the pandemic has also opened our eyes, especially to already these existing inequalities. And when you look at even some countries giving some briefings without providing sign language interpretations and things like that, it really draws us to the question of where are we now, and how can we ensure that we make sure that more progress can be put, or more efforts can be put into ensuring that society really embraces inclusive language opportunities, especially for deaf people.
Thank you very much. That was a very important submission. Now, I delve in more into my next question. I've shared it at the chat sessions, so you can as well be looking at it. Can you, just like I asked early on, if you can share with us some of the challenges you encountered in your effort in promoting inclusiveness in early childhood education for the deaf and hearing?
Thank you, Christabel, for that question. Sure. So the challenges are many. I experience the challenges every day because this is a new thing that we're really trying to do, even though there are some schools or some organizations that are really working on this. And we all know that advocacy is not really like a nice area, right? When you're pushing people to go out of the comfort zones to do things that they are not used to, it's really an area that is really difficult. But I think that the reason why we started this and the impact that it is creating is much more important every day to me and to Devio, than the challenges that we see. So we do a lot of focusing on where we're going, where the future is for inclusive education, looking at the impact that we're getting. A couple of days ago, I had a school that, confirmed to me in Ghana and said, because you've been doing this and pushing for this, next time when schools reopen, I'm going to include sign language in my programs. And that is like a really big, impact for me. It's a really big impact for all children because, it's not just about us. It's about the children who are future leaders. It's about the children who are looking up to us for a just and equitable future, right? Think about this. 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So none of us are actually left out of that, idea of, well, it is, there are children with disabilities and yeah, there are my children. No, this is something that affects each and every one of us. This could be your child This could be your neighbor's child. This could be your sister or your father's child. This could be anybody in your community, right? So we are just creating a future for our own children to be able to exceed and excel in life, no matter wherever they find themselves. They don't have to be discriminated at any point because they were not able to receive basic education because of their disabilities. This is why we encouraging you that no matter what the challenges are, no matter how tough it is, let us all contribute in our own way. We wouldn't be able to figure it out from the beginning. It's going to be a difficult journey, but with the impact that we have seen so far, with the stories we have heard, with the progress that we see, with the kind of future that we're cheering towards, if we all take action, there is going to be a time that we are going to be proud and say that we have really created a better future for all our children, not just my children, not just your children, but every child in the world. And that is the goal for us.
I love that. I really love that. That is forward thinking.
Thank you.
Whatever initiative and whatever action, whatever decision we decide today in support of advocating for inclusiveness has a long way of affecting the future. It could be my children, your children, or someone else's. Thank you so much. We take a message from Hannah. Hannah says that this conference has been a great eye-opener for me. Though I am early childhood educator, I have not really given serious attention to inclusion as discussed in this conference. Wow. Lily, please, do you have something to tell Hannah about this?
Well, I will say thank you, Hannah. And this is the reason why Iiecef 2020 was created, because of the need to inspire people and to enlighten people. So for her to say that, I'm really grateful that we have been able, the VO Early Childhood Institute has been able to, create that impact. And we look forward to more, stories and impacts and comments from people, and even more action in individuals and grassroots stakeholders taking action to support children with or without disabilities.
Thank you very much. And to you, Hannah, thank you so much for actually taking the time, participating in the conference from the onset until the last day. And thank you for that great feedback. We'll move on to my next question, and it says, do you think governments and policy framers tap enough into the valuable expertise of advocates within the disabled community as part of a national policy framework? If your thoughts, and then how can it be improved? If it's yes, how can it be improved? And if it's no, what can we do about this situation?
Thank you, Christabel. So I think that, governments focus on areas that they think would benefit their people or will benefit their countries and their communities. And when it comes to inclusive early childhood education, especially, I will start from Ghana. Ghana has ratified policies that shows that, the country wants to support inclusive education, or the country supports inclusive education. And as Will mentioned, about 185 countries have ratified these policies. So they already accept that this is something that needs to be implemented. We as individuals, we as parents, we as civil society organizations, as families, we need these policies to be really in effect. We need them to be implemented because we have children, we engage children every day. And when you look at the number of parents or families, especially in Africa, with the low and middle income families are more than the high income families, we need to do more to ensure that these leaders see that this is a critical area they need to invest in and they need to support. So without advocacy and pushing them to really take a look at the policies they have ratified and make sure that they implement and work on approaches to make sure that these are really in effect, we wouldn't see any progress. So this is the time, and Iiecef is just to kind of push all of us out of our comfort zone, to inspire us, to help us take a look at these inequalities that exist in our communities each and every day, and see how we can all contribute in our own small ways to make sure that change happens and happens at the right time for all children.
Change happens, and it happens at the right time for children. Thank you so much. And I love the fact that this is the right time, because the atmosphere has been charged, our thought has been provoked, and our mood has also been ignited for us to rise up to be great advocates of this inclusiveness in education. So Timothy would like to have an interactive session with you by voicing out his question. So Timothy, if you can hear me, kindly unmute yourself. And if your background is very silent, if it's distracted, then you may have to type in. But if you have a very sound background, please unmute yourself, and then Lily is ready to take your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And Lily, Lily, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I enjoyed your presentation, and I'm really happy about the work the VO is doing in Ghana.
Thank you
but
so
I have
much.
some few questions and a comment. My question is related to the fact that we also have local village sign languages in Ghana. At least we have identified about 2 of them. One in the eastern region called Adamobe Sign Language, and they also have children there. And one is also in the western region, and the language is called Nanabin Sign Language. So these are 2 village sign language which they also have children, and it's totally different from the national sign language. So my question is related to the fact that are you planning to do anything for such group of people? Then can I follow up with my comment, which is kindly related to these 2 village sign languages? So my comment was that I think earlier on in the presentation, I heard you saying that our national sign language, and particularly to be Ghanaian Sign Language, was derived from our local languages. From my studies, I don't think that would be an accurate depiction of our national sign language, even though we could say that our national sign language is growing and we have some element of the local languages inside. But all over Africa, especially in West Africa and all over Africa, deaf education started with foreigners who decided to help deaf people in Africa. Ghana has a very unique example of that, and they introduced foreign sign language. In the situation of Ghana, it was an American sign language which was introduced to Ghana. So our national sign language actually originally started as an American sign language, but gradually, as we already know that language developed, they could grow. You know, we have some element of our local element in the language. So I think that national sign language will not necessarily be something that we will say that it was derived from our local languages. And another comment is that I was also happy to see that you are promoting our national sign language. So all over Africa, I've seen advocates normally advocating for our indigenous local sign languages to the detriment of national sign language, because they feel that these are foreign languages the deaf are using in countries, and they feel that we should rather encourage the deaf to use some of our local language. I mean, I'm talking about other countries, particularly what I know is Nigeria, South Africa. Sometimes they also advocate for their indigenous sign language instead of the national sign languages we have. So these are just comments, but my main question is on what about our local indigenous sign language we have in Ghana?
Thank you so much. That is really great question and comments to make, Timothy. I really appreciate that. So I think if I understood you correctly, you mentioned, you talked about, our national sign language starting from the international sign language with Iiecef. That is correct. That is also due to, factors from colonialism and things like that that I don't really want to go into. But what I will say is that even though these has elements of, foreign sign languages, it still has our local spoken languages embedded in them. And at this point, I will say that we have really come a long way. When you look at the Ghanaian Sign Language Dictionary and all that, it is now what we have now as GSL is now the accepted kind of national sign language that we are using as a country. And I believe the other countries that have also recognized, the other 46 countries that currently recognize and use their sign languages, is the same thing. So we cannot go back and remove that foreign element that already exists, but we can only expand on where we are now and grow what we have. So yes, that is true, but it definitely has our spoken language in it. And that is why, also looking at the way education is growing, and, there is now a whole, like the whole world is now like a small village, right? So we also are trying to offer a kind of education to our young children to ensure that they can fit in every society that they are. So yeah, it's been inclusive. If we have the foreign sign language in it and we have the Ghanaian, these all come together and make it inclusive. And teaching our children with these languages would also help them to even communicate with other people in other parts of the world. And that is the beauty about it, right? So I would say that let's just keep, and I know a lot of people keep asking, why don't we use one sign language, internationally? This is a question that people always ask, but it again comes to the fact that we have our natural languages infused in these sign languages, and so it is good for our children to learn the national sign language that each country uses, so that they grow with that culture and deaf identity that is also part of the sign language development process as well. So thank you so much for the comments and the questions, and I hope I've been able to touch most on the things that you had.
Hello, Timothy.
Yes.
I hope you have been answered.
Yes, the majority of them, but I was hoping for a comment on okay, so let me make this clear. So in a village in Western region called Nanabin, there are deaf children there, and they don't use the national sign language. They use a language called Nanabin Sign Language. So, and also
Timothy, actually in the central region, not the Western region.
Oh yeah, thank you, yeah. Yes, then in the Eastern region, and in the Eastern region too, there is a village called Adamobe Sign Language. There are deaf children there, and they also use, especially those who have not gotten access to education yet, they also use a local sign language. So I was also wondering if Devio would be interested in providing education in their, what do we call it, their existing languages they use there.
Okay, thank you so much, Timothy. So with the training of teachers program, at this moment, we haven't really grown the capacity of, and really like a big, national program, right? Even though we are able to have teachers from various parts of the world. And when COVID started, we even had our training programs targeting teachers out of Ghana. So we had online sessions, online webinars that had teachers from other parts of the world joining. So once we are able to work with teachers or early years teachers who can really support these children, there wouldn't be that problem. I know this is the beginning of that growth for us as an organization, and even growth as a nation, and even as inclusive education worldwide. There is going to be that point where we'll get and definitely be able to support. So we are growing, we are working as an organization. We really want to expand into all the 10 regions, but it comes with work, a lot of work. It comes with a lot of investments, and it comes with a lot of commitments in various ways. So yes, Timothy, we will get there, but I may not be able at this time to tell you exactly when. I wish we can do that as soon as possible. Again, the area that that we are working at is a less investment area where a lot of focus is not given to that. So it will take a couple of years. It will take some time, I would say, but we will eventually get there. So thank you so much for drawing
Yeah,
the
thank you.
attention to that, and we will keep it in our books and work on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Timothy, for your questions and comments, and thank you, Lily, for your answers. It's been a really great session. I've enjoyed myself so much. But let's continue.
I think
We have a
Clement has
message
his hand raised. Clement, you have a question?
Yes, it's actually is Francis interpreting, so I can go ahead and ask the question quickly.
I cannot see. I think
I can
Francis is
see
having
Francis.
issues.
You can see
Issues
Francis
at the moment.
No.
Okay, good. So
No, I think
just a quick one.
issues.
This has been an awesome program, and I think you are doing very well in this, the view especially. But a concern that I've been thinking about for some time is, in Ghana, for example, and Francis can bear me out because he's a teacher, that when teachers are posted to deaf schools, some of them come there with little or no knowledge at all about sign language and how to use the language to, instruct the students. And it's been a problem. So you can just imagine a teacher comes around, does not know a word in sign language, and this teacher is supposed to be teaching social studies, or let's say English or mathematics. For how long, this teacher does not know. So you start from the known to the unknown. Okay, you need to familiarize yourself with these students, get to know their level of thinking. And if you don't know sign language, how do you impact these students when you are teaching social studies or English or mathematics? It's going to be difficult. This teacher is going to take 6 months, 1 year to learn basic sign language before he or she can be in a very good position to impact some knowledge when it comes to his profession as a teacher. Now, what is the view and your organization going to do in this regard? Because in Ghana, they think special education equates to learning sign language and using the language effectively to teach. But the answer is a big no, because you go to the university, you learn special education, part of it is sign language. But when it comes to the usage of the language, the dynamics are totally different. So at the colleges of education and the special education departments at our universities, how can the view advocate and push for proper learning of the language before teachers are posted to deaf schools in those respective countries, and in this case, Ghana in particular?
Thank you so much, Clement. That is a very great question. I think when you look at the way the whole forum was structured, we structured it in a way to really also cover some of these things. And I would go back to Alan and Thomas Sabella's presentation yesterday on building the workforce of early childhood, teachers. So the reason why we actually brought that session is for people to understand that, yes, we want to push for inclusion. Yes, we want teachers and schools to offer sign language, the sign language to children, both deaf and hearing. But then also it has to come with some level of proficiency and some level of, like a high proficiency. And Alan mentioned that even he, as a deaf person, right, who has received deaf education or received ASL education since has been using it for all his life. Before he had to be placed in schools to teach deaf children as a Peace Corps volunteer, he had to pass the ASL proficiency test. And we are hoping to work with various deaf associations to see how we can actually create some of these tests to ensure that even if deaf youth people, we want to work with deaf because we want to also give them the opportunity to get an opportunity to be employed in in schools that really need to introduce sign language to their students. And this test has to be passed because we want to make sure that the children who are learning the language from the foundational level grow up with a quality language that is really authentic and pure, and also from the actual national sign language that is being used in that country. So it all work. We would work towards that. It wouldn't be something that we will achieve in a day, but we will keep on advocating with for these some of these things, even to getting other civil society organizations, working along with us, because if we want to really achieve an inclusive early childhood education, we have to work with other people as well. We have to work with other organizations from the local, regional, national, and even at the global level. So we need each and everyone who is also interested to collaborate with us as an expert, as again, back to data and things like that. You are welcome to bring in your contribution, because we can achieve inclusive education if we all work together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Um,
Thank you. I was just
thank
soaking.
you.
Clement, you still have a further question?
Yes, just a contribution this time around. So, the Ghana National Association of the Deaf, I work very closely with them because I am probably the chair or the president of the National Association of Sign Language Interpreters in Ghana. And this is what they have for, interpreters. There's going to be an assessment for all sign language interpreters in Ghana. You are issued a sort of an identity card. But because of you concentrating on education, if you can get in touch with the NAT and see how best with other, CSOs push for this, especially at the colleges of education, at the university, especially the special education department, that look, before identify teachers who want to go to maybe be posted to deaf schools and give them additional training, whatever they did at special education or the colleges of education, it is enough. They've been taught how to teach. But how to teach in a special school should also come with specialized training. But this is what is lacking in the country, and it is creating a huge gap when it comes to, knowledge acquisition at the schools. And a typical example is what Alan talked about yesterday, signing exact English. This is a problem here in Ghana, that teachers are so comfortable with signing exact English. Now, when you talk about some of these things in spoken language, we input and input, it sounds almost the same, but in context, the meanings, they do change. But with a deaf person, when they see the word, then that one meaning is there. If you use sign exact English to teach these deaf students, at the end of the day, when they are reading and they see the word, in context, the meaning is different. But because they know who one, meaning for that particular word, they keep it, and that is it forever. Teachers must be taught to know that, apart from teaching deaf people, you need to know about the deaf culture, and that will impact you positively whenever you are educating them. And that is one area you can collaborate strongly with the National Association of the Deaf in Ghana, that is GNAD, and the university departments. I think once that place is targeted, then deaf students are going to benefit tremendously when the teachers are sent to the deaf schools.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clement. So we've actually been working under the grounds to see how we can get to do this assessment with NAD, and even with Unicef and with the Ghana Education Service. So these are things, and I'm really happy that the Ghana Education Service really was happy to see how we can work together. And so that is something that gives me a lot of hope that very soon we will see inclusive education, especially national sign languages, in our Ghanaian classrooms. And that gives us hope. So we will keep working with some of these local organizations, or with these government institutions to see how we can implement some of these strategies and these solutions that are really working. So thank you so much for the input, and thank you, Will. Thank you so much for sharing. Will says, thank you for sharing the great work you're doing and looking toward.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Will. I'm so passionate about this. And I hope that, I've been able to inspire each one of you who have attended, Iiecef 2020 on behalf of Devio as well. I want to thank each one of you for contributing, especially with the speakers who have taken their time, prepared their slides and everything. We appreciate you, but I think that the children that these policies and these interventions are going to actually impact are even more grateful to you, from the speakers to the participants to everybody, the interpreters, Clement and Francis, to even you, Christabel, who has moderated these sessions very well. We are truly honored to have you all, and thank you so much. We're looking forward to working with any of you. You can send us any thoughts through our emails, and we will definitely respond and see how we can all work together to promote national sign languages and the early years. And we are hoping to see most of you back next year, Iiecef 2021. I'm hoping by that time we would have made a lot of progress, and most of you would also have a lot of stories and a lot of impact to share with us. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you to Lily. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you to the VIO Early Childhood Institute for thinking about the children as well, thinking about the teachers, thinking about the parents, thinking about the stakeholders.